Hello students. So we shall now start with the introduction to Breaking Silence by Janice Mirikitani. I had earlier posted a voice clip on the same poem. I hope all of you have listened to that voice clip. Now let me start from the text. Janice Mirikitani is an award-winning poet, dancer, activist, and educator who is renowned for her commitment to work that addresses the horrors of war. She advocates against institutional racism and the enslavement of women and the poor. She is the author of 4 collections of poetry and has edited numerous literary anthologies. In 2000, she was appointed Poet Laureate of the city of San Francisco. So we understand that Janice Mirikitani has established herself not just as a poet but also as a dancer, activist and educator, and she has also openly expressed her strong dissatisfaction with the horrors of war and also with the consequences of war. Then she has also fought for the cause of women and the underprivileged sections of society, and most importantly, she has also spoken against any kind of racism and oppression. And this explains the strong protest content that is reflected in many of her major works. Then she is the author of 4 collections of poetry, and there are 2 collections which are very famous, Awake in the River and Shedding Silence. And she has also served as the editor of a number of literary anthologies or collections. In 2000, she was also appointed Poet Laureate, which is an official recognition granted to her by the city of San Francisco. Now we shall continue with the next para. Born in Stockton, California, Mirikitani was incarcerated as an infant with her family in the Rover concentration camp in Arkansas during World War II. So, she was born at a place called Stockton in California, and she was incarcerated as an infant with her family in a concentration camp located at Rover in Arkansas. So I've already talked about what incarceration is. That implies a kind of confinement or imprisonment, and the whole episode happened during the Second World War. So she was a small child and she was confined along with her family in the Rover concentration camp in Arkansas. Now, Rover concentration camp was a Japanese American internment camp that was located in rural southeastern Arkansas. Now, Arkansas is a state in the southern region of United States. So, she had such a horrifying experience as an infant, and this happened during the time of the Second World War. Following their release from camp, her family moved to Chicago to avoid the racism that was still rampant on the West Coast, but soon after her parents divorced. Now we find that after being released from the internment camps, her family had relocated to Chicago, and the reason was to avoid the racism that was quite rampant on the West Coast. Now, the West Coast of the United States indicates places like California, Washington, Los Angeles, and they felt that by shifting from the West Coast, they could probably free themselves from racist oppression. Now we find some details about her family being given here. When Mirikitani's mother remarried and relocated to rural Petaluma, the 5-year-old Mirikitani was forced to endure years of emotional isolation, poverty, and the trauma of sexual abuse by her stepfather, which lasted for nearly a decade. So, after going through that harrowing experience at the internment camp, she had to face some difficult situations in her own family. This was because she was sexually abused by her stepfather, and this resulted in a period of isolation, disillusionment, and emotional trauma for Mirikitani. These repressed emotions, both personal and those of the Japanese American community who suffered during the war, became the basis of her poetry in coming years. So, her personal experiences as well as the social ostracism that she had to face on account of her ethnicity formed the basis of her poetry in the coming years. So she consciously tries to break the several stereotypes about Asian Americans prevalent in mainstream American society, and also infuses a very powerful social and political element in her works. As a result, it becomes very difficult to separate her writing from the several ongoing struggles of people belonging to the marginalized sections of society, people who are victimized and oppressed in different ways. Now let us continue with the third paragraph. As depicted in her own writing, the 1960s were a tumultuous time for her both personally and politically. Although she graduated from UCLA and received a teaching credential from UC Berkeley in the spirit, she continued to struggle with questions of identity and stereotypes of Asian American women. So, during the 1960s, she associated herself with several political causes, and on the personal front, she had completed her education from University of California, Los Angeles, and had also received a teaching credential from University of California, Berkeley during this period. But that did not stop her from getting herself involved in a number of other serious political issues. In 1970, while pursuing a graduate degree in creative writing at San Francisco State College, she participated in the Third World Liberation Front, joined the artist collective Third World Communications, and became the editor of Aeon, one of the earliest Asian American literary publications. So we find her exploring questions about identity and individuality, countering major stereotypes perpetuated by American culture with regard to Asian American women in particular, and thereby attempting to critique some of the established expectations and conceptions about Asian Americans in general. In 1970, while pursuing a degree in creative writing, she had participated in the Third World Liberation Front and had also joined an artistic collective called Third World Communications, and also became an editor of Aeon, which was one of the earliest Asian American literary publications. It included the writings of Asian American writers. Let me continue. In the late 1970s, she began working with artists and writers to edit Ayumi, a Japanese American anthology, a major bilingual anthology featuring 4 generations of Japanese American writers, poets, and graphic artists. Her first book of prose and poetry, Awake in the River, was published in 1978. So apart from being the editor of one of the earliest Asian American publications titled Aeon, she had also associated with an anthology called Ayumi, which was a Japanese American anthology, and it consisted of the writings of 4 generations of Japanese Americans, and it was bilingual in nature. And her first book of prose and poetry is titled Awake in the River, and that was published in the year 1978. I had mentioned this collection at the beginning of this lesson. Let us continue with the other details. In addition to being a prolific writer, Mirikitani is also the founding president of the Glide Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing services for San Francisco's marginalized communities. So she had also associated with a charity organization called Glide Foundation, which worked for the marginalized sections in San Francisco. Then she has developed more than 80 programs for the poor and homeless to encourage them to make meaningful changes in their lives, to break the cycle of poverty and dependence. So the last line of this paragraph shows her concern for the underprivileged sections of society, for the poor and the homeless, for those who are always subjugated and subordinated, helping them to lead better lives, helping them to change their life conditions, and also helping them to come out of a condition of poverty and dependence. This offers another instance of her abiding concern for humanity in general. Continuing with the next para, her dedication to community activism and advocacy has received worldwide recognition. She is the recipient of more than 40 awards and honors. So, her actions have been recognized with a number of awards and honors, including the prestigious American Book Lifetime Achievement Award for Literature, and in 1988, the California State Assembly named Mirikitani Woman of the Year in the 17th Assembly District. So, these are some of the honors that she won, and these honors stand testimony to the fact that she was not just a great writer, but also a great human being. Now, in the next paragraph, we find a list of some of her major works. Janice Mirikitani's published works are Awake in the River, Shedding Silence, We the Dangerous, and Love Works. In 2014, she released a fifth collection of poems entitled Out of the Dust, New and Selected Poems. I hope all these details are clear to you. Now, the next paragraph talks exclusively about the poem that has been prescribed for study, which is Breaking Silence. So I'll just read that para. Janice Mirikitani's poem Breaking Silence reflects on the knowledge of silence of the generation of Japanese Americans. This is a poem that focuses on the experiences of Japanese Americans when they were put into internment camps during World War II. She expresses her mother's experience feeling dehumanized and isolated from the world. Mirikitani expresses that her mother did not have a voice, and with her expression of silence, she leads to a brutal experience of how Japanese Americans were treated. So this paragraph talks about the nature of the poem Breaking Silence. It talks about how Asian Americans in the past and present have used silence as a means for protecting themselves, and how throughout the difficult period of the internment experience, the entire Japanese Americans remained silent. They kept their silence to protect themselves from forced oppression. And she also talks about her mother's experience of alienation, of being dehumanized on account of being subjugated by the authorities. So the poem throws light on the feelings of pain, agony, anguish, shame, and helplessness experienced by the Japanese Americans in general, particularly focusing on her own personal experience